All right, thank you so much. Thank you everyone for being here. Thank you, Peter and Tala, for joining and inviting me to be part of this. You know, we are all, I think probably everyone in this room considers themselves familiar with Peter's work. It is, as they say, you know it when you see it. But you know, that said, the reception over time has really shifted. And even one could argue that to some extent the meaning of the thing has shifted through time with different kinds of reception. Going back to the beginning, if I may be so bold, because there's an exhibition in Europe of 80s paintings coming up now as well. If there was a bone to be picked with the work, if there was a strike against it that was in the world, it actually didn't have anything to do with the signature style. It was the idea of Peter illustrating theory, quote unquote. The idea that, and more specifically, the cell and conduit model that we're still sort of seeing in some iteration around us, and that intellectual boogeyman, Jean Baudrillard. Dramatic pause. The idea that we're all astronauts, living our lives infinitely and perpetually at the dashboard, virtually speaking. And at that time, it was probably abstract, theoretical. Now it's a little bit more intuitive, something that we encounter on a daily basis. Please turn your cell phones off in terms of sound. But that take also would lose, I think, something that's essential about the work, which is how you actually encounter it in space. What has it been historically or at that earlier moment when it was up against, say, the windows on the Lower East Side in an apartment, or with the piping, which you can sort of see some here, like those kinds of conduits, like the sort of grammatical hiccups that would happen that would make you re-see and re-encounter the space, or the Rolodex, which would be too akin, just a little bit too akin, uncanny. All that's repressed would start to come out in that space. And as he said, quoting you in one of my favorite quotes of you is, I took the Barnett Newman zip and I made it into plumbing. What's around that impulse? What's around that impulse? And something like that is also kind of remarkable, and you can see it on the screen there, where it extends even to an amazing installation that happened a few years ago at Lever House, where it's as if Broadway Boogie Woogie becomes the molten core of Park Avenue at that point, adopting the language of the very sort of corporate organization of society and its technologies. They're in real space. So with that, moving forward, it's a question of painting being knocked off its pedestal. So another term, I'm glad I looked at my notes, because actually another thing that I love, a quote from you, is your Chanel No. 5 being invented at the same time as Cubism. And that's coincidence and not. These things use the first synthetic perfume. Painting is not apart from the world. Art is not apart from the world. One actually has to see it as part of that extended complex. And that's one of the reasons why over time in our relationship it's been great, where seeing you write about fashion, bringing in fashion, working with Index magazine, extending out across, just really across different kinds of cultural productions. And then what becomes key in that extension, I think, is you are also the head of the painting department at Yale, which brings us to one incredible artist, Tala Madani. Studied at Yale in the mid-2000s. When I first realized this, I thought in the context of your brilliant survey, which is coming to a close this weekend at MoCA, one painting called Blackboard Education, which I believe has a figure shitting out identical graduate students. We can get to the bottom of those inspirations later in conversation, I think. But obviously what's also key is the sending up of, as you said yourself, machismo, of a certain kind of art making, of undercutting a kind of aesthetic as it might begin to reinscribe your power structures, which not only relates to what's happening in art, but obviously a continuing political situation in Iran, and how that sort of artistic perspective does have everything to do with that larger sphere. So I'm truly looking forward to getting into that further. When we first spoke about this today, I remember you with great relish said, we really have to give it to Peter. I thought, oh my, I was like, oh my God, she's going to take this guy apart. And you were like, no, I mean, give him the platform.
Yeah. Thank you.
But there was a moment. And the thing is, it was a slip, it's a joke. But there's also a truth in it where, looking historically, criticality, complicity, maybe there's another model. Maybe in that sort of skip and slippage, there are other ways to do it. And in our next conversation, the thing that you both said that you wanted to gravitate to is the idea of parody, the idea of play, the idea of humor in your work, which it seems you have a great kinship around. The idea of there being other tools available and other modes of expression, in turn. However the likenesses or dislikenesses of your work might be. So with that, and without further ado, I put the first question in two parts to you, Peter, and then Tala. How did you first get interested in parody, and how did it work? How did it function, your work initially? How might you see it now? And then Tala, how did you recognize yourself in or around that, or what other models came out in turn?
Well, I think the whole basis of my work started with a parodic gesture. The idea that you would take the square, the sort of symbol that comes from minimalism and Malevich and neoplasticism, and put bars on it and call it a prison, was a parodic gesture. And then this is the early 1980s, and what I always remember is when I first came to New York, and when you thought about abstract painting, you thought of each artist having a typical tactile surface, whether it was stain painting or some kind of brush surface or scumble or whatever. So the idea of rolling on a surface mechanically, a kind of parodic product gesture of creating a signature surface seemed kind of funny to me. And even though all that is parodic, it also comes with a certain kind of psychological punch, because I identified the prison and the square very much with masculinity, and the idea that the square is not some sort of ideal Euclidean form, but rather a confining structure, which at first I called a prison, and then I began to call them cells. But for me, it was also about a back in the day of beat culture. A guy who wasn't hip was called a square. So it was also a kind of critique of masculine self-containment.
Was that when you first encountered Peter's work? Was that?
It was. I mean, I'll answer your question about parody, but just to give a little bit of a purview for our wonderful audience. Peter was the dean of the graduate department painting department at Yale, and I came from Oregon to Yale without much I was really definitely not savvy about New York art history at all. I mean, what I had learned was just about sort of classic, European art history, if anything. So yeah, it was an introduction. It was, I mean, people used to come to Yale to study with Peter. I mean, specifically applied just so they could work with him. And the department that Peter ran was so interesting, because he found, he would invite many artists, and he would find artists that are, that would be very dissimilar to his own practice. The strength of his, which I think relates to his work, was that his sensitivity visually was so right, so strong. I learned more from seeing how he would react to objects that even his language, which as you can see is very, obviously present, but his physical reaction was so informative for me, just because his sensitivity to visual forms was strong. But yes, that was the first time that I came across Peter's work at Yale. Parody, I mean, as you were just talking, I was thinking about how much parody relies on a social agreement about something, right? Like you're responding to the gesture, or this was so, and so the rolling on is a difference. So to be parodic is like you have to know what you're pushing against. There has to be something stable, something that everybody agrees on, so that you can push against it. And so what's super interesting, I think, now is, do we agree on anything? Is there anything? So how does one append it? How does one, so in a way, what you said about you want to throw, what did you say? You said you're throwing the painting off its pedestal. I think that I think that definitely is something that we can all, I mean, that's still in play. I think a lot of painterly gestures have opened up so much that we can't rely. So for me, in terms of parody, what I think constantly about is that idea of irreverence, or how do you sort of turn it upside down in terms of value? How do you work with power structures in whatever form to just to tilt it? And not sadly, not as clearly kind of a historic, continuity that in the 80s one could kind of rely on.
I'm kind of curious because you recently about your work, you said that many of your paintings are jokes without punchlines. And the idea of it not having a punchline is a way to actually engage the person, the audience. Like it's a way, I think you actually even go so far as to say to create a connection, with the audience. They have to make the decision, they have to make up their own punchline.
It's very interesting, satire, parody, humor. I think they're all right. They're kind of. I don't want to sort of talk ahead of our talk, but I was thinking about: is there satire for the right? I mean, does the right wing, the right sort of political structure, do they use satire much?
I fear if you look on certain networks, that the idea that the right's humor is better than the left's at present.
Really?
I've read that headline, and we can.
Interesting. I'm interested. I mean, historically, I wonder if, has there been historical movements from the right that have used that as a tool? It's interesting.
I don't think Mussolini.
But that's the whole thing. Is humor is all about creating more than one meaning,
right,
at once.
And that's a problem for that.
Yeah, and you have to be able to have that flexibility.
Exactly.
And
it requires flexibility. It requires
ambiguity.
The existence of duality, the possibility of two things, simultaneous things.
Right, seeing the thing in its opposite.
In its opposite, yeah. Exactly.
But going back to, actually, it's interesting. If we can talk about this political context. We can talk about the political context in which you emerged, which is very Reagan, very corporate before the meltdown. And one of the curiosities is easy for me to say from my position many years later, but you were sort of getting it from the left and the right at one, because here you're using humor to deflate the idea of the heroic artist. At the same time that you're in the system, mm-hmm. So there are those who are saying that you're just actually a market creature, even while you're undermining authorship. And you were just laughing by yourself.
Well, that was a curious situation. There was a show at the Boston ICA called Endgame about new art from New York in about 1985. And the curators, included myself and 4 or 5 other artists, but the people who were, the critics who were chosen to write were all associated with October magazine. And I think it's the only museum show where the critics who contributed essays disliked the show.
Oh, interesting.
Basically because it was object-based, and from the left, the point of view at the time was, unless it was photomechanical, unless it was not painting or sculpture, it wasn't valid.
And you were being droll on some level, you were being humorous, and was that grasped at that juncture in terms of how you were using humor at that time?
I don't know. I mean, to me, it's such an intrinsic strategy that I'm not sure if I felt that people should think they were funny, but that's the creative, and that's the engine of my creativity, a kind of parodic impulse, and perhaps iconoclastic impulse.
How would you say that relates to your work, or how?
I mean, it's just so
at Yale
impossible to know how the joke sits, right? Like you said, it's an impulse and a tool, and one could use it creatively, but it's just so difficult. I mean, it's just so difficult to understand how anybody sees or takes anything in. That's really not for the maker to necessarily. One can project and play with that, but.
Yeah, let me interrupt you, Tala, because
Please.
Even at Yale, you had begun to make the paintings of men doing funny stuff.
Yeah.
And I would look at these paintings and just be completely mesmerized and unable to place what was going on. Because they weren't about rage, they weren't about the emotion behind them was elusive. I couldn't put my finger on it. And that's to me what gave them their power.
Yeah, I think humor.
But for you, the pie in the face was almost like a trope of humor.
Yeah, I think it was more like a release. I think it's sort of. It's so funny you mentioned the word punchline. In a way, the paintings operate like as if the joke's already been told and we're cleaning the area afterwards. You know, it's post-punchline painting.
Yeah. I think that's one of the reasons you might have annoyed those people around Endgame, because actually you gave away the game in advance. Like you're saying what it's about, even though it might be about something. Your offer. It's what was the phrase you used? Post-punchline.
Post-punchline cleanup, right?
That's pretty good.
No, but yeah. No, but humor, I mean, I do think metabolism, and instead of humor, because humor is so precise, so specific, like you have to find it funny, that's humor. Instead of humor, I kind of like the idea of metabolism. I mean, works that affect you metabolically, whether they kind of like, they just bring out some form of release, whether that's pleasure or humor or something physical. I think I trust that basically in myself, that like, oh, I'm giddy, or I'm nervous, or something's happening metabolically, and so I can follow that, And I think being in here, we're affected, well, visually, but also I think sensory too. It's interesting talking to you before this, about your position about sort of the separation that you were interested in making your work in relation to the sort of spiritual abstraction that was so prevalent. But was it that prevalent in the 80s in New York, or was that already being a shift?
Well, among abstract painters, it certainly were. I mean, the heroic figures were people like Agnes Martin and Bryce Martin, etc.
Yeah.
But I sort of arrived in the wake of neo-expressionism, which was all about the artist as heroic individualist. And it was quite a political crisis for me, because it seemed so Reagan-esque. Reagan as the avatar of a new kind of heroic American individualism, and the same could be said for the neo-expressionist artists who their work was based on their own internal psychology, not with very little attention to their social position, and the fact that they were virtuosi, very good at making paintings. So that was probably the most immediate thing to push against.
And I find the continuation of that language quite key and relevant in not compromising on that position of your language, of the sort of the continuation of the cells and conduits, and finding form within the sort of economy of that is really sort of sticking to this. I find quite interesting.
Well, let me say something about that, because I honestly still believe that the space I describe in my paintings is the prototypical paradigmatic space of contemporary life. You know, we go along pathways, they're compartmentalized endpoints, like if you're in front of your computer screen, or if you're in your automobile on a highway, or if you're in an apartment and then go on a subway to somebody else's apartment, that these cells are connected by conduits. And the same thing applies to the digital world, for sure, and the organizational world of flowcharts, etc. But at the same time, I'd chosen these three icons, and I grew up with a fascination with art of the 60s and 70s, which was based on what I call a thought experiment.
A thought experiment.
A thought experiment. And the person I love to use as an example is Dan Flavin. So this guy says one day, I'm going to make sculpture out of fluorescent lights. Bad idea. Like, this is not going to work. But he made it work for 30 years, and I think of it as a thought experiment. So having established this language with these pretty dumb, iconic elements, the idea of like a Dan Flavin trying to see where that goes after decade is important to me.
Yeah.
Do you feel like there are analogies in your practice to be had?
It's very hard. It's very hard. I'm not sure. I really don't know. I think the circumstances are slightly different. I mean, for me, the paintings become, I think there's definitely a lot of shared strategies. Like you said, this belief in, or wanting to kind of destroy the high art idea, you know, is definitely a shared strategy. But somehow for me, the canvas becomes actually a space of performance. It doesn't become the prison, it becomes the space that I can inhabit because I'm not interested in the space, in the physical space that I am in. So it becomes like a reflection of interior space, but not so much for like the hero artist presentation, but more of a more like it's just a safe space for like performance, because I can't perform, so I can perform with paint in a sense. But I'm definitely interested in virtuoso like breaking, and you know, painting is just about technology. You just have to sort of find the right tools for the mark you want to make. It's quite easy.
You know, the funniest thing, one of the things I enjoyed most about your show, when I think about applying Rolodex to achieve the idea of texture, all the shit bomb paintings where the oil paint becomes shit.
Yeah.
It's such a great joke.
Thank you. Yeah, no, it's true. It's sort of, I do also believe in paint. I mean, I do believe in paint. And I think Peter believes in paint too. I mean, look at these colors.
Oh, absolutely.
You know?
You believe in paint, but you believe in bad taste.
Yes, I mean, this is so important, right, I mean, what is bad taste? What's good? I mean, the question of what's good and bad is just the problem.
Yeah.
I mean, you can't, what is good and what's bad is sort of you can't really quite hold it. Mm-hmm. It's maybe, oh God, we opened that can of worms.
One could say shit bomb is bad taste.
Yeah, no, it's great. I like the shit. I mean, I think, you know, we get tomatoes, right? Like Bill Gates grows tomatoes. The tomato seeds don't, you know, the shit's like our savior. Yes. No, I think...
it's just metabolical.
Just what is it?
Metabolical.
I mean, it's just paint. I mean, we have had artists in history who've actually boxed, you know, feces. Like, so this is really PG. I mean, I'm not doing anything that metabolical. This is just purely brown paint. You know, I just call it that, right? It's just in the title. Sadly, I mean, I wish I could. I can't, right? That's where like, I'm not a performer, right? I can't, you know, physically not interested in that real space. Yeah, I think for me, it's really difficult to think about the good or bad taste, but I try, because you want to break your own consciousness. You want to break your own expectations. So that's useful to think about bad taste, so that you don't fall into your own proclivities. But yeah.
And I'm kind of curious, I mean, just because we are speaking across eras, generations, there's a specific moment around painting that you were grappling with. It's interesting, I was reading one early review, I think, of your work, maybe Lombard Fried.
This is me?
Yeah, of you. Basically, you through what you were doing, it offered a promising future of painting.
Of me?
Yes,
I did?
Of you, yeah.
I can't tell you. I don't read reviews. You know, it's sort of...
Due respect.
You know, because it's sort of, it's not for me. Mm-hmm. You know what I mean? It's just, I do what it's sort of, I mean, it could be for me, but maybe in different times. Not yet.
But there's this question of just, you know...
But what a promise. I mean, that's just a bunch of baloney. I mean, what am I a promise a bunch of painting? I mean, you know what I mean.
Well,
I mean, this is recorded. Sorry, not a baloney. If you
but
wrote it.
But this is the question of, you had a pretty firm grip of what you were bumping up against, whether it was the stakes of painting or the stakes of dialogues around authorship at one point. And it might be a little bit more ambiguous now, or maybe not.
It's very ambiguous.
Yeah, how is it even possible to have that sort of measure of good versus bad taste? How do you construct? How do you make a good joke? And what's the language you can use to actually construct something?
Well, it is very, very interesting, right? Because we're in this the social media, the digital has completely. I mean, you were saying that your paintings, the way they look digitally, that you had the response that they look like paintings, right? But I think we are being conditioned continuously now by the way we're consuming artworks this size. And I think you can fight back against or push back against your outside realities, what Peter was saying, to respond to the outside, to place your work within the condition which you're making it and have a response to that. Not just the interior, but to recognize that your interior is actually having a response to the exterior anyway, so that you can actually, acknowledge that. I mean, I think we're in a really difficult place. I think someone told me, so I don't know if it's true, but that the sort of post, and I think about that sort of generation of post 9/11 generation grew up in a world where they're not quite comfortable with satire, let's say, or there is a psychological need for sincerity. Mm-hmm. Maybe it's like post-trauma situation. So the need for sincerity complicates the ability to be satirical or joke-making. But I was reflecting that these have been tools of the masses. Satire. It's the tools of punching up. So we can't, for the sake of not offending anybody, give up those tools of humor, of satire, of punching, up or sideways or diagonally. So I think we have to come to terms of, you mentioned the situation in Iran, for instance. I think, for instance, right now, the left is really uncomfortable criticizing, let's say, the Iran government because of fear of being called Islamophobia. Because of the rampant Islamophobicness of the last decades, I think there's a fear there of what if we get it wrong, and yet you could be a Muslim fascist, and so it's okay to be called out as such, just because So it's going to be interesting. I think we have to come to terms with being okay offending, while we try to meander a path through the shit that we're in politically.
Is that something you encounter around your own work, even within the art context, as you draw from caricature and political sphere? With the art world, everybody's so polite. I'm sure they might, but they don't tell you necessarily. Questions are later.
Yes, please. So I think, gosh, yeah. I mean, I was asked to put some of my animations on Mubi. It's a video platform, and the film world is honest. Right? They'll tell you what they think. And I think the art world isn't that sort of, we're polite. We respect each other's ways and processes. Yeah, so I became jealous of that sort of fervent honesty within the film world of best thing about this is the title.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I like punches. I roll with the punches. Yeah. Yale was punchy. Yeah.
Well, the other thing that goes along with that is the idea of ideology has been abandoned. So back in the day, I disliked New Expressionist painters, not because they were incompetent, but my worldview was diametrically opposed to theirs.
That's right.
And I think the discussion about art has, the idea of ideology has somewhat disappeared. That one is fighting for or against a particular political viewpoint.
Accurate.
Yes or no?
I think there's a question, for sure. I think here again, it's interesting to encounter there are different generations, like another generation in school right now who's actually lived through, you were talking about post 9/11, but 9/11, then the financial meltdown, and then the political spectrum, and even just the question of the makeup of institutions at this point, is one in which all the things that might have been abstract and theoretical and stuff that you would read in books are things lived every day, where it's just part of, I don't want to, it's a little bit more of lived experience, and which is not unique. Obviously in other countries like Iran, it's this is ever more dramatic, in terms of its immediacy and palpability and stakes. But I sort of think, I don't know, maybe I'm coming off as idealistic in terms of what tomorrow might bring. But at least right now, it goes back to the question I was putting forward of, what are you bumping up against? What's the language you've got? If people are being polite on the one hand, and on the other hand, not sure what the ideological positions are, then how you actually forward what you do in art is tenuous at best.
But it's interesting too, because I always feel like the problem with schools, I mean, I've been teaching at USC, I've taught around recently, and I think there's something, I realize that we just don't know what kind of art we need as a species in the future. We just don't know what we need. I mean, it's also, what we make fulfills something that we as individuals need as makers. So we're responding to our own need, and that I think will have a resonance to the public that we have among us. And we just don't know what that is in the future. And so the problem with art education is that pedagogically it's very difficult to sort of teach this idea of we don't know what in 20 years the population will need to see. And how do you go? And now make, now go. And that openness, that unknown step is quite uncomfortable, right, as a teacher to sort of put forward. Because, and art history is one thing, but it's not quite taught as art history. It's taught as ideology, in fact, right, very often. So sort of how do we even come, so yeah. That's it. The punchline is taken away. Fill in the blank.
To go back to some of these images that we have here, and you brought up 9/11, post 9/11, and when we were in the back room, you actually described some of these works as your post 9/11 trauma paintings.
Oh, that's right.
And that also, not to give away the game either, but here, slips, jokes, Freudianisms, you both actually share that as well, where you actually have one painting which is a quote unquote a Freudian painting, and
it's called Freudian painting.
In case you missed the joke, and then of course there's Shit Mom with disco babies. So Peter, could you take it away, illuminate us on?
Well, it's that's a 9/11 painting. That's the Twin Towers with the. Then the prism became a coffin underneath it. And let's see what the next one is. What is the next one? What is the baby doing?
A disco baby?
Disco baby.
Disco baby. I like to place it in sort of an unfamiliar place, you know, put the baby in the disco. Raising hope, too.
I like anthropomorphizing Raising Hope, the square as a disco baby in the middle of that.
It can happen. Shitty de Milo. You know, if your arms fall, the baby falls. For me, the paintings are very sort of animate. I mean, sort of there's like one thing, and then another thing happens, and another thing happens. And similar. I can, you know, you sort of move it. This thing, this signifier moves that way, and then another way, and
Right.
they, you know, within Peter's language, it's a world.
And then the
Joel.
prison started bursting out of the background.
Impressions.
And then there's a jail.
And actually, how you describe things shifting in your painting is akin to how you describe things literally in your paintings, in terms of things being turned on their sides, inverted. The cell becomes a grave. Like actually flipping the geometries continually. So it might seem the same, but you're actually putting things in the wrong places.
I'm kind of into balancing acts lately.
What is it that attracts you to the balancing act?
Well, things have gotten so crazy that I think of a lot of the paintings in this show as unstable. Oh, that one to me looks like it's about to fall over. And there is actually only 3 of the paintings in this room do this, but there's a running joke when I made these, which is in most of the paintings there's one prison or cell touching the bottom, and all the others are supported by that one prison or cell, like a circus strongman holding up 4 other people or something like that. So that little red square is holding up that whole mountain of forms.
And do you anticipate people finding it humorous when they look at it?
No.
So it's an in-joke.
Well, it's what's fascinating me right now, that I'm looking at that, and there's that blue prison shape, and it's grounded, but nothing else is grounded in it. Everything else is stuck to that to hold it up. And that's sort of how these came about.
Would you say that your humor is different from how it was initially?
I'm also into games. So it's a kind of a game that there's one thing on the ground and it's holding up all the other things. And there's a couple paintings in there where I took the same composition and it was a horizontal painting, and then I turned it sideways to make a vertical painting. Mm-hmm. So that's sort of like a game move. So along with humor, parody, games are important to me.
There's also the humor is also quite, has different volume sets, right? I mean, I like to think of humor in tones, like black humor, white humor, blue humor, yellow humor, green humor, right? And so they're not all the same kind of funny, mm-hmm. while they're all humorous in a way too. So that's.
You've also said that you use humor to deal with things that are too dark to deal with.
Well, I mean, I think everybody does. I mean, that's, I think, why we have jokes. I think it's pretty human.
Definitely.
Yeah.
There was one back there about my dad dying.
The which side?
Can we go back?
There's a clicker somewhere. A rogue clicker. Which painting were you looking at? Where were you thinking?
It's about 4 back.
This is one of the earliest ones that you have.
That's about 85. I put some of those in there because of your all the black paintings you've been doing.
Yeah.
Mine were based on early video games, and yours are called projections.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. There's a lot of cinema envy in a lot of my paintings. This interest in projections.
There it is.
This one.
So that's the parent cell and the child cell, and then underground is a daddy cell. So that, I mean, my father died when I was 3, so Tala was just saying humor is a way of dealing with tragedy. And I painted that in '83, I guess I was 30. So it both deals with something tragic and, to me, says it in a funny way.
They're deeply personal.
Yeah.
Deeply personal.
Right.
Yeah.
I do feel there's a parallel to
Definitely.
the way you work.
This interesting about finding the language that is so impersonal, to be able then to open up to the deeply personal. I mean, the language of, like, so that it works for you. This not having to deal with the idea of whatever the hand, the artist's hand, etc. So that it's not, but then also it's so accessible because of that. Because it's not suggesting that it's undoable, right? It's, yeah, I think that's quite interesting for me.
Yeah, I was thinking it was so interesting because almost all your work is based on the touch of the brush, and ideally my work is based on not touching it.
Yeah.
I do touch them, but there is no trace of the hand, trace of the gesture of the body, etc.
No, I mean the objectness of painting, I think, was quite important for me from being at Yale at that time. This importance of that the image is only maybe 20%, maybe even less, meaning of the work. That is so much about the surface, and the attitude of the work is communicated from that objectness of it, not so much from the image. That changes everything. So I think but it's interesting that doesn't, for you, follow into the spiritual. That the objects, though how important it is to communicate that, because I could easily have a spiritual relationship with your paintings. They do elevate sometimes for me, metabolically again. They're charged, they're very charged. They have this heightened attitude, positive attitude sometimes. So in that way, I don't necessarily see them as totally separate from the tradition of the spiritual and abstraction. Even though that might have been the impulse in the 80s, and I think politically that must have been a must at that time to find the work. But I don't know if they stayed there throughout.
Well, I'm complimented, but
But no.
no, things and their opposite are often true at the same time.
That's true. That's very accurate.
And I have to, confess that ultimately my paintings are about light, and some people think that has a connection with spirituality.
Well, they're about light. I mean, but that's sufficient. I mean, with having it or not having it. I mean, the projection paintings for me are the reduction of the light, the historical light in painting, through the medium, through a projection, through a medium, through some kind of a facilitated, preordained messaging device.
The thing that I have no patience for is spirituality in art as a marketing device. And in a Godard movie, Contempt, the corrupt American producer says, when I hear the word art, I get out my checkbook.
Yeah.
And so my joke is when I hear the word spirituality, I get out my checkbook. So,
well, that's a thing. That's a position to push against. Is the reality of
but you can say it about another artist, but you shouldn't say it about yourself.
Yeah.
Well, I'd like to turn this and open it to the audience for any questions and dialogue. I have further questions in my pocket, but I'd love to hear from others. Yes.
Hey guys, hey Peter.
Hey Tim.
It's actually just a couple observations and maybe we'll promote a response. Peter, I think something that kind of got passed on is that, you know, in response to things like parody and humor, another way of saying what I think your answers were to those is that you were trying to say, I think, that you kind of also, those things got left at the studio door. You know, that the paintings themselves didn't necessarily have to rely on those things that were important to you in the making about, you know, the kind of in-jokes, and you know, that they're not made explicit. I actually, as someone who got to New York right after you started showing, that I think that that's what has helped your work outlast many of your peers. They kind of thought that all that stuff had to go outside the studio door with the work. And that leads me then to the other point, like Tala, when you said you don't read reviews, that's good, because I think I'm still enough of a dinosaur that, like, you know, I think critics don't write reviews for the artist, they write it for the work, you know, and for the audience too, but that you know, that how these works function independently of this entity called Peter Halley, I think is what makes their strength and the longevity of them. But I just wanted to go, Peter, because I think that the shift maybe in criticism and contextualizing that's happened from the time you started till now, and again, you were at Yale, I was chair of painting at SAIC for 5 years, you know, like having students that like really want to believe that all that kind of stuff that's in them that has led to the making is somehow going to be there when they're not sitting next to it during a critique. And it's somehow going to last. And neither of those things are necessarily true. And again, because you kind of had a point where if you weren't going to be a neo-expressionist, you had to sort of rail against them because that's how dominant it was for you. That's not really something that younger artists, younger painters even have an opportunity to struggle with today. So it is sort of apples and oranges, I would say. But I think the main point is that, like, what's so amazing to me about your work is the way that it's always a Peter Halley, but I don't really have to, like, get that involved in you. And I mean that as a compliment. Right. So I just wanted to have a reaction to that.
You know, your comment just through free association reminds me of something else that for a long time I resisted the term postmodernism, but the early 80s in a variety of fields, architecture, art, music, design, it was this phenomenon called postmodernism did happen. And what it was a people no longer believed in the idealistic or utopian impulses of the creative of the century that had come before, whether that's, you know, the idealism of neoplasticism or the Bauhaus. So my work and a lot of other people's was about, in a parodic fashion, or questioning that the belief system of of all that 20th century modernism.
What are the colors of comedy?
What are the colors of comedy?
Yeah. You said each has a different color. I'm so intrigued by that. I wonder if Peter knew that.
There's this great text, I love this text, written by, it's actually the introduction to this book. The introduction was written by John Welshman, and it's for the book Sphinx. I think it's Sphinx. And it's called Black Sphinx or Black Humor. And it's a Mike Kelly book, and in it he does, and I think he's putting it together himself, but obviously we know black humor, brown humor, there's just this idea of that the tones can, what I took from that and what I like about that is that the tones can simply position you in different places to take in the work. He goes on about sort of like the green of, this, the yellow of vomit. I mean, there's a lot of like riffing on that, you know, in that essay. Yeah, of course. It's a good essay, yeah.
Do you have a favorite color of comedy?
All of them.
All of them.
All of them.
Yeah.
Please.
Just decisions of scale for work, and here, like these pieces feel like they're the perfect depth, or like, is it the way the color interacts, like it has to be on this scale, and then at your show, like, I walked in the final room, these cloud paintings, the chiffon work, just the shifts in scale, or how you know something's the size it needs to be.
Well, I've always believed in anthropometric scale, the size of the painting and the elements within the painting based on the human body. And things have shifted over the years, but initially all these boxes were a size that you might feel you could be contained in them. And I've also found I've never been able to make a huge painting. I was fortunate to be commissioned to do a 40-foot wide painting for the airport in Dallas. And what I ended up doing was making a grid of 8 paintings, not much bigger than these, because I just couldn't figure out how to make one 40 feet wide.
I think about the anthropomorphic is, yeah, I also think about sometimes a scale as like the ego of the painting. And can it be big, or will it just overflow? Will that ego just overflow and then it's too awful? And then it's so that then it has to be confined in a smaller scale. So the larger it is because somehow the painting is holding back some of its demonstrative aspects, so it can be in fact big. So I like to think of it in those terms of how much stuff is there and can it be contained.
When I see one of your small paintings, I feel you're talking to us personally, like it's a more intimate conversation.
It's very true. They're more like sort of interiors. There's a very bizarre, there's a very arbitrary horizon line. I mean, the invention of the horizon line, I think, is so fascinating. Why do they teach kids that horizon line from first grade? And it sticks, and it's there, and we can't ever escape it. And yeah, it works. It definitely works.
Sorry,
but it's a grounding. It's a permanent grounding of your mind, basically. To that.
It's just really hard for me to hear you and not think of the landscape painting in your
the new
show,
landscape,
which is just one. How big could that have been?
Could that have been? That could be very big. It's the new landscape. I mean, it's about sort of culture of ass worshipping. And I think at this moment that could be very big. We're in that culture, yeah.
Any questions?
Yeah.
No one's got rid of the horizon line. We still live it, it's still
Yeah.
there. It's outside, it's still there.
Yeah.
But we don't live it, we're still in a three-dimensional world. It's something that our experience, we deal with every day. It exists in our perception. What do we see without it is maybe the question.
Well, it's hard to imagine closing on a better note.
Thank you.
I will sort of leap on that. Thank you all so much for being here. Thank you, Tala. Thank you so much, Peter.
Thanks,
And
Tim.